Sure.
I'll introduce it. And ready to go? Okay. So we're speaking on our book, Speaking Truth to Power, which I don't urge you to buy right now because the paperback isn't out yet, but the hardcover is prohibitively expensive. But the book is in some ways a product of COVID. That is, as others noticed as well, during the first year of the COVID epidemic, there was quite a lot of conflict between experts and decision makers, with some decision makers, including the president, rejecting expert advice, other decision makers embracing it, some experts giving what turned out not to be very good advice, and ordinary Americans seem to be divided along political grounds, which was in and of itself an interesting phenomenon, because there's no particular reason why COVID should have been politicized. In fact, we had a graduate student from Puerto Rico who expressed some concern about this. She said in Puerto Rico, all the parties agreed that vaccination was a good thing, and everybody got vaccinated. They had the much higher vaccination rate than the mainland. But in the US, COVID became thoroughly politicized. For the most part, Democrats thought vaccinations were a good idea. Many Republicans who thought they were following the lead of the president, who himself got vaccinated, decided that vaccinations were a bad idea. And then, as we should have known, but I didn't, I wasn't fully aware of this, in the United States, there already existed a pretty substantial anti-vaccination culture. Again, I had a student in my seminar, thank God it was on Zoom, who said that her family didn't believe in vaccination. And she seemed an otherwise intelligent person. I said, no vaccination? She said, nope. I said, your kids haven't had polio vaccinations? No. Measles? Nothing? I said, no, we think vaccination is bad. So I bit my tongue rather than ask her why, because I thought I would get strange responses. But there is a substantial non or anti vaccination culture. As we're seeing now, we discover there are a lot of people who haven't had polio vaccinations. Some for religious reasons, some for other reasons. So at any rate, we started to think about, the relationship between experts, decision makers, conflicts between experts and decision makers. And we thought to situate this in the larger context of American democracy, where there's always been a conflict between expertise and democratic politics. Andrew Jackson famously said, I wrote down the quotes, I wouldn't screw it up. He said, the duties of all public officers are, or at least admit to being made so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. In other words, you don't need experts, anybody can do it. The contrary view was, of course, associated with progressivism. 19th century progressives believed in government by experts. And, Walter Lippmann, who was a famous progressive journalist, asserted that American government required a cadre of technocrats to guide decision makers. The government should be turned over to experts. And these have always been the competing views in the United States, and we saw them rise again in during the COVID epidemic. So in our book, and Collin will go provide more detail and other aspects of it, but we find that there are numerous incompatibilities between the needs of experts and the perspectives of policymakers. I'm sorry, the perspective of experts and the needs of policymakers. They often don't speak the same language. Experts often offer advice that is not particularly relevant to policymakers' perceived needs. And more generally, sometimes experts want to say the best thing to do is do nothing, but policymakers generally need to do something, whatever it is. Both experts and policymakers can suffer from cognitive entrenchment. That is, they may become so committed to their beliefs that they find it difficult or impossible to act in ways inconsistent with those beliefs. One famous instance of a policymaker who was so cognitively entrenched that it almost led to the destruction of his country was Joseph Stalin, who had become convinced that his foreign policy, which included a treaty with Nazi Germany, was brilliant, foolproof, and no one should challenge it. So when his intelligence officers came to him with an actual copy of the German plan to invade Russia, a copy that Soviet spy agencies had smuggled out of Germany, Stalin became incensed. And he said, this is impossible because these facts did not comport with his beliefs. And he went so far as to declare that the people bringing him this terrible idea must be, as he said, wreckers and saboteurs. He had them all, the Soviet term was liquidated. And the Germans attacked and very nearly defeated the USSR, as we know. And then we have the special problem of bureaucracy. Bureaucracies march, and this is across the world, bureaucracies march to their own drummers. They don't want outside advice. They are required by law to seek outside advice. They all have federal advisory commissions and whatnot. But bureaucracies have their own reasons for thinking and doing what they do, and they don't want anyone to tell them otherwise. As they used to say, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Navy way. And in the Navy, we do it the Navy way. And we're not concerned with what other people think. Now, the Navy has cool uniforms and everything, but every bureaucracy in town is like that. Believe it or not, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Department of Agriculture way. If anyone here has worked for the Department of Agriculture, just as a quick aside, we had a student who wrote his thesis on the Department of Agriculture's response to, it was then a Clinton-Gore era computer initiative. Everybody was supposed to make great strides in computerization. They were supposed to purchase laptops, whatnot. So he said the Department of Agriculture did what it was told and purchased 40,000 laptops. And then rented warehouse space and put all the laptops in the warehouse because they didn't do that. So this is a particular problem. So I'm gonna turn to Collin, who will talk about that and many of our other findings. And then afterward, we'll hopefully have time for questions. Or do you want people to break in?
I think it might be better if I try to power through the whole thing,
Okay.
and then we'll do questions at the end. I think might be a little smoother. So, all right. Well, thanks, Ben. For those in the audience and those in here and online, I we skipped introduction. So my name is Collin Paschall. I'm the program director for the data analytics and policy program here at Johns Hopkins in the advanced academic programs. And Ben is our the faculty chair for the Center for Advanced Governmental Studies.
And their founder and leader.
He is our noble leader, who we follow. He's an expert in Johns Hopkins. So,
right.
So anyway, it's been a pleasure to work on this book with Ben. It's been interesting. Scholarly books, you start writing them 2 years ago. You finally get around to doing the book talk months after the manuscript is already finished. And you go back and you reread the book and you think, there's some things here that were really smart. And there are some other things that you think, maybe I would have done it a little differently. But fortunately, in this book, I think the balance of it is far more on the smart side than the regrettable side. So the book's only 130 pages, so it's an easy read, but I think it's rich with a lot of content and a lot of interesting material, some of which Ben has already covered, I think, very well in his introduction. And I'm just going to kind of reinforce some of it here and do my absolute best to give you sort of an overview of the project and some of the main findings that we came to. So, as Ben discussed in his introduction, this book really came into being partially because of the controversy over expertise that grew out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And has been explained very well, not only was this a tragedy in a epidemiological sense and a human sense, but it also brought to the forefront of our politics this conflict between the teams of experts and the will of the people in some sense. I mean, sometimes those things were lined up in this case. There were obviously many millions of people that were perfectly happy to follow the recommendations of the CDC, who believe in vaccinations, who are trying to do the responsible thing along those lines. But it also opened up in our society, some clear fissures over how comfortable people are with groups of outside experts and bureaucrats making really significant decisions for them without necessarily giving people a clear opportunity to weigh in on that before the entire economy gets shut down and everything goes into a lockdown. So it's an axis of controversy in our politics, which emerged, especially during the last several years. But of course, expertise and its role in political conflict is not confined to COVID-19. I mean, I would suggest, for instance, that a lot of the controversy over election results that we see today could be cast as a conflict about the role of expertise in our society. People vote, seems like it should be a straightforward process. But in fact, we're turning our voting over to teams of experts who are professional administrators of elections. This seems like a foreign and scary process to many people. And so part of even a conflict like that is about experts versus what seems like a relatively simpler process. And there are many other examples. Climate change is another instance. The experts on climate change all essentially universally agree that it is a real phenomenon. It's going to cause serious ecological crises in our future. It's going to cause significant economic disruption. But these teams of experts, for the most part, have lived in think tanks. They've lived in universities. They've lived far removed from the experience of average citizens who may find it difficult to piece together the rather disparate evidence of climate change in their day-to-day life. So huge sacrifices are being asked of people by experts, and people tend to resist making big sacrifices, both individual citizens and communities more generally. So in examples like this and many others, the concept of expertise is really enmeshed into many of our political conflicts, and that's what we wanted to write more about in this book. And we sort of have, I would say, sort of two central themes of the book. And the first is what I just said. Expertise cannot be divorced from politics. It will always be a political matter. And further, expertise is good in the sense that it does provide technical solutions to at least some of our problems. But as Ben has already described a bit, it can also be politically very problematic. And at times, experts might not always have the best solutions for our problems, or at least the agreed upon solution by the consensus community of experts may not always be the right solution to our problems. If you start to think a little bit broader about the downstream effects of some of the things like lockdowns and quarantines and decarbonization. I'm not saying in that statement that I disagree with any of those things. I for one, think climate change is a serious issue. I, for one, think that, public health is important, but it goes to show that, these things become problematic in our politics, more broadly. So we begin the book in our opening chapter with sort of a broad look at the history of the United States with respect to expertise, and Ben described some of this already. I mean, going back to the framing of the Republic, the founders, the framers, people like Jefferson, Franklin, even Washington. These were people that were interested in political theory and democratic principles. They were also intensely practical people who were interested in scientific advancement and trying to apply the best tools of their day, be it engineering or be it political institutional ideas, trying to apply those problems to democracy. So they were, in a sense, the American Republic is, in a sense, an experiment with fusing expertise and governance in a way. And so this thread of experts, their role in our society, continues throughout the entire history of the Republic, going through the Jacksonian era, the rise of popularism in that dimension, the counter movement of progressivism, trying to use insights of social science and science generally to guide our governance, and continuing into the 20th century. Trumpism is in some ways the apex of this conflict of Trump, who has very little interest in the views of anything that disagrees with his political interests, disdain for expertise generally among the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. This comes up over and over and over again, and it continues to be this battle between the administrative state, agencies, bureaucracies, specialists who are making decisions for citizens, versus the idea that citizens should be one making the decisions, and we're uncomfortable offloading some of our policymaking to administrative agencies. In theory, the delegation of authority from citizens to legislatures to agencies seems like a effective arrangement. It's a way to bring expertise into politics. But there are, as Ben mentioned, these fundamental mismatches. Politicians are not always going to be only policy motivated, right? They're interested in re-election. Some of them are cognitively entrenched. They may not like listening to experts. Politicians have relatively short planning horizons. They may not want to implement the kinds of changes that communities of experts would like to implement in society because of the long-term payback. The fact that the benefits of those kind of interventions could be dispersed over a long period of time and not politically relevant. And another problem that we talk about in the book is that experts just provide too much advice sometimes. Walk down the street here in Washington, D.C., go walk next door. You're going to find the American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institution, and keep going a walking tour of the city. There are 1,000 think tanks filled with thousands of experts who will all have advice, and it's not all going to be the same. And so it becomes a difficult challenge for policymakers to even know who to trust and who to listen to, and compound that difficulty for citizens. There's just so much expertise in society. It's hard to know what to do with it these days. So as I went and looked back at the book, I kind of see it as two sort of sections in a sense. The second, third, and fourth chapters of the book, we try to look at some use cases of expertise in our society and evaluate whether or not expertise in fact has all the benefits that we'd have expected to. And we look at this in terms of the domains of sort of predictive governance, which is the application of artificial intelligence and predictive analytics to policy problems. We look at the specific use case of expertise as a tool in crises, and when politicians don't know what to do, maybe they can turn to experts to make decisions for them. And then we also look a bit at this issue of institutionalizing expertise. Are there ways that we could, through legal or regulatory structures, ensure that our policymaking is informed by communities of experts? And Ben mentioned these federal advisory committees. I'll talk about those in a minute, but we're trying to investigate the efficacy of these kinds of efforts to institutionalize expertise. Then the final two substantive chapters of the book, chapters 5 and 6, we zoom out a little bit and we try to think about some of the downside risks of infusing expertise into our politics in terms of just the risks that accompany any kind of significant policy change. And then we also discuss in the final chapter of the book the way that expertise can become grist for the mill of political conflict. Ideas, theories that experts develop become new dimensions of political conflict. They can actually divide people, even if the intention of the theory is to bring theoretical clarity or empirical clarity to the world. And the case study that comes to mind most clearly for this, and I'll talk about in a minute, is the development of the theory of systemic racism in our society, which had a clarifying effect in an empirical or theoretical sense, but has now become a new axis of conflict. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. So chapter 2 of the book, we talk about modern predictive analytics. This is a chapter I wrote primarily with Ben's help on this one. We kind of split different chapters we were primarily responsible for. So in this chapter, I provide sort of an overview of modern predictive techniques using things like game theory, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I try to show the potential for these kinds of tools for doing really useful things like predicting the outbreak of civil wars, or economic modeling that can allow you to see like when recessions may happen, or sort of big structural factors that can be predicted with the right kinds of data sets. And these are incredibly powerful technologies, and we acknowledge that in the chapter. The issue, of course, is sort of twofold. One is that to use these kinds of predictive analytics requires a large amount of data. It requires experts who are exceptionally good at interpreting the data and interpreting analysis and asking the right questions of the data. And then you actually have to get the politicians to agree to the findings that you present to them. So if you are able to assemble a bureaucratic process, which would even allow you to use these kind of predictive analytics, there's plenty of examples of politicians simply ignoring prophecies of doom and destruction in the future. You look at the case of the 9/11 attacks. In hindsight, there was plenty of evidence that something like this was planned. The intelligence agencies knew about it, but the information was unable to be distributed and acted upon for a variety of bureaucratic reasons, short-sightedness, and so on and so forth. Another example would be something like the 737 MAX disaster. This is in the corporate world. The 737 MAX was Boeing's airliner. There were some technical issues with the plane. Engineers knew about it. It was destined to eventually cause some kind of crisis, some kind of disaster, but the information didn't flow through the corporate bureaucracy in such a way that allowed them to act on it. And so even when you tell a political leader that there's a disaster on the way, that is little guarantee that anything is actually going to be done about this disaster. And this is the problem which is apparent across many domains of policy in and outside of government. So predictive analytics, we assess to be a powerful tool, but certainly not a cure-all, and we shouldn't expect it to be to necessarily revolutionize government in the way that I think some of the technicians and specialists might expect it to. The following chapter of the book, we look at this use case of expertise in moments of crisis. And Ben and I have both mentioned COVID already. This seems like exactly the kind of instance when a crisis happens, the political leaders turn to the experts will tell them what to do, and that will allow them to resolve the crisis in the best way possible. And thinking about this, it is true, and some of Ben's previous work about violence and warfare speaks to this point. Crises can be a means for rationality. When you are facing an opposing army marching upon your field, it's probably a good time to think about the situation realistically, and turn to your generals to solve the problem, lest you lose your state. So pressure can bring clarity, but if you look more broadly, it's not always true that turning to the well-established experts is the right way to go. We have several case studies along these lines in the book of sort of what are the profiles of leadership that are best suited for dealing with a crisis. One of them is, Ben talks about the Japanese Navy in World War II. The Japanese naval bureaucracy was very entrenched in their own way of thinking, and they refused to believe that aircraft carriers were going to be a particularly effective weapon of war. There's closed-mindedness, even though in the face of junior officers telling them that this was going to be a problem, the closed-mindedness of these highly trained specialists led to the naval defeats that ultimately presaged victory in the Pacific for the United States. And if you look at other examples across history, you find all kinds of instances of leaders who don't have a traditional profile of expertise really being in the best position to manage crises. Ben talks about the example of Ulysses S. Grant in the book as a case study. Grant was an officer of little renown earlier in his career. He was a personal failure in a variety of ways. Yet this person who would not be considered a traditional expert in the sense of like the highly trained, most esteemed military strategist of his era managed to be the one that actually saw how to defeat the Confederacy. And so an unorthodox background and ability to look more broadly at evidence, to not be confined by doctrinaire thinking, actually can be of greater value in a crisis than might be someone who follows the more structured or the disciplinary norms in which they are brought up professionally. And we generalize this even more by referring to some social psychology work from Philip Tetlock, building on that work, which Tetlock's work is focused on finding what are the cognitive characteristics of people who are really good at forecasting, so predicting the future. And the punchline of Tetlock's work is that people who are in this state of perpetual beta, so a state of perpetual change, redevelopment, reevaluation, non-judgmental thinkers who are open to new ideas, these people are the best at forecasting. And we speculate that some of these same characteristics also apply to the people who are best positioned to manage crises. And we run a little survey experiment in the book where we present survey respondents with a variety of different sort of crisis situations, ask them how we respond, and we find that those individuals who are sort of highest on these measures of cognitive openness to experience tend to be the ones who are most flexible in crises. So in some sense, this chapter is a reminder that the deep experts with the most expertise might not always be the people you really want in the chair making the decisions in the moment of crisis. You may want to open your mind and open your consideration to a wider cross-section of individual. As you can tell, we jump around to a lot of different big ideas in this book. So bear with me as I keep moving through there. But moving from the micro case of these case studies of individuals and the way they navigate crises, we also, in the next chapter in the book, we talk about the ability of our political processes to institutionalize expertise as a mechanism for guiding decision making. And this is where we talk about this example of the Federal Advisory Committee. So to give you just a bit of background into this, throughout American history, there have been a pattern of governmental officials going out into the advocacy communities, into academic communities, soliciting ideas and trying to get information from outside experts to guide all kinds of policymaking efforts, both in the legislative and in the regulatory domain. And so in the 1970s, this process was formalized into the Federal Advisory Committees. And these committees are groups that are convened by federal agencies to help make recommendations about policy. These include things like, every federal agency has these to some degree, making defense policy, health policy, agricultural policy, every policy in the world. They convene these teams of outside experts with the intention of those experts informing better policymaking. Using this as a case study, we do an analysis, we look at other scholarship in this area, we do a bit of a historical review, and we actually do some original data analysis, which shows that the composition of these committees are, in fact, strategically composed in such a way as to provide information which political principles prefer. So, for instance, when the Biden administration came into power back in 2021, one of the very first things they did was they cleaned house. They took all the experts at the Trump community, that the Trump administration had convened for these things, and threw them out on the streets, closed committees, reorganized them, made sure that the expert advice that they were getting was the expert advice which was most likely to align with their own policy preferences. Now, as a matter of political response to this, that might make sense, but the issue, of course, is that there's no reason to think necessarily that one ideological wing of one party actually has a monopoly of good ideas. So it's not as though we're really trying to use these committees for impartial input and expertise into our politics, but rather it really is a strategic game to make sure that the experts are telling you the advice that you want to hear, and you simply ignore the advice that you do not want to hear. So even when we try to institutionalize neutral competence into our policymaking processes, political requirements mandate that this is not a stable arrangement. Inevitably, political principles will try to manipulate their own guide of expertise to get what they want. So those are sort of the three use cases that we went through, and in each of them, we provide, frankly, a bit of a skeptical take on the ability of our political system to integrate impartial expertise into its decision-making. This is perhaps not a fruitless endeavor, but certainly a difficult one. And so in the final two chapters of the book, we zoom out a little bit and we ask the question of, even if we could get expertise into our politics and into our decision-making, is that really a good thing? And so in the 5th chapter of the book, we go through some of the downsides of using power at all to get your decision. So this applies to governmental power, but any kind of exercise of authority. There are always risks to action. So if an expert or a politician really wants to do something, they can do it, but they should be aware that projects always go over budget, they take too long, they can be a disaster. This is endemic of academic, corporate, and governmental settings. The possibility of blowback is always there. If you use power to try to force people to do something, the resistance to that can actually double in response to it. There are all kinds of suboptimal trade-offs and transaction costs associated with the exercise of power. When you're using political power, in particular, the possibility of a special interest group capturing authority of that process is always a serious risk, which can lead to rent collection. And public policies very often end up creating these moral hazards where government actually enables very bad risks, very bad decisions by companies or individuals. And you can look at situations like the kinds of financial arrangements that led to the financial crisis, or even like the federal student loan system today. There's people that take on inordinate risks, take on lots of debt, and this is a function of governmental policy. So even if you did follow the advice of expertise, any exercise of governmental power runs the risk of these kinds of outcomes. And so this is why Ben mentioned earlier, sometimes the best advice that experts can give is to do absolutely nothing at all. And that's uncomfortable because we as a society are conditioned to think that experts can in fact solve our problems. Sorry to say, some problems just aren't solvable, and it might be better to just let some problems exist. And that's not really concordant with our overall political culture or our technical culture that we live in this day. Finally, the final chapter of the book is this kind of macro historical look at the role of experts in our society. And although we certainly agree that experts have technical knowledge that they can bring to bear to solve our crises, we also have to be aware that expertise provides a set of weapons for politicians to use in their political combat with one another. So experts can create narratives, they can interpret events, they discredit rivals, they develop narrative consistent solutions to problems. Experts are useful, but they also create this substrate of this intellectual substrate upon which our politics rests, and new ideas introduced into that substrate can create divisions within it. And so the example that we give in this, the extended example we talk about in this chapter is this concept of systemic racism, and we mentioned the idea of critical race theory. Theories like these are dangerous things because even though they can provide empirical and theoretical clarity to social phenomena, they can then become targets of attacks from other communities of experts, and it can actually create new divisions on our society. So it's interesting that the guy who is essentially responsible for all the controversy about critical race theory is a guy named Chris Rufo, who is associated with the Manhattan Institute. Chris Rufo, critical race theory was a relatively unknown thing. It wasn't part of our wide culture, our broader popular culture, till Chris Rufo, reading these texts at some point during his career, realized that some of these ideas in this school of social analytical thought could be powerful rhetorical weapons for the Republican Party and for the conservative movement. So Chris Rufo took this idea, highlighted it, spread it to the world, and created an entire new axis of conflict in our politics, which did not exist before. And that axis of conflict was created by experts who were trying to study something completely different. So the broader point is that every time you introduce a new idea, every time a new community of experts tries to explain the world, they might be adding some clarity to it, but they're also opening it up for a broader kind of conflict, which can have downstream effects and can divide our society in problematic ways. So I've done my best to summarize the book as quickly as I could, but to reiterate a few things. One of the main conclusions in the book is that expertise, we need to recognize it as scholars as not only an important technical force, but an important political force. And we should be considering it that way as an important actor in that broader landscape. Truth can certainly be a corrective to power, but can also be a servant to it. So in the hands of politically powerful individuals. Concepts, ideas, theories can be dangerous things. They can impinge on personal liberty. They can create political conflict. And you have to realize there's two sides to expertise in our society. And I think more generally, I think we want to remind the readers that expertise cannot and should not be considered a replacement for other forms of public deliberation, other kinds of democratic processes. The idea that we're going to be able to offload all of our technical problems, all of our political problems to communities of experts is frankly, it's just a naive notion. Expertise creates problems even as it solves them. And so today in our society, we have to contend with that and figure out how we can make government work, and keeping in mind the limitations of what we can really do technically through the application of expertise. I did my best.
All right.
Ben, I turn it over to you.
Well, actually, why don't we leave a moment for a comment? I have a few comments, but I'll wait. Questions, comments?
So in my work, I've been looking recently at the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. And the reason I've been looking at it is because as part of that legislation, agencies are supposed to be putting a lot of effort into developing statistical evidence they can use for policymaking. They're staffing up, they're upskilling their workers, they are hiring in this area, creating leadership positions in this area. What are your and so this is sort of the direction that the administration would like these agencies to go in terms of how they approach decision making. It seems, from your talk, like this is perhaps a little, I don't know, maybe narrow-minded or kind of, maybe there should be other considerations that they take into account in terms of thinking about how they should approach decision making and policy making, or sort of what are your thoughts on this trend of evidence-based policy making, the push for it that we see going on at the federal level?
Well, evidence-based policymaking is a good idea. We certainly want to proceed on the basis of evidence, but agencies and other decision makers will tend to accumulate evidence that supports the position that they have decided upon, but they have bolstered and buttressed that position. So I think that's what we always need to watch for. Again, going back to bureaucracies, who are the gatherers of evidence, bureaucratic agencies, as many of you know, have particular cultures, I think we call them. And these cultures are often deeply ingrained in the agency's, they arise from the agency's history, they're deeply ingrained in the agency's goals and procedures, and agencies are very resistant to doing anything that's inconsistent with their culture. It's something we all joke about, the Navy way, but it's very serious because an agency culture serves a variety of interests. In most agencies, the culture bolsters the power of the leadership group within the agency. They are the ones who benefit from and promulgate that culture. So, Collin's example of admirals in the Second World War, and in almost every country, navies were ruled by battleship admirals, who didn't much like the idea of aircraft carriers, because that would undermine their own claims for leadership of the service. Now, the Japanese did the United States the favor of sinking its battleships, which allowed a new group of admirals to take charge of the Navy and demonstrate that aircraft carriers were indeed a better weapon. So I'm sure that prior to World War II, navies collected a great deal of data proving to Congress or whoever controlled their budgets, that battleships were indeed the weapon that would carry the nation's interests forward into the coming decades. So, evidence-based policymaking is not new. Bureaucracies collect evidence, but they collect evidence that serves their preconceptions. And the question is, what can we do to force bureaucracies or other institutions to look at more than one sort of evidence. Well, historically, crisis is such a mechanism. In his History of the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides said, war is a stern teacher, because in the crisis of warfare, decision makers either do or die. Sometimes they die, but those who hope to survive will modify their views, modify their activities, and learn to do something differently. In the United States, as Collin mentioned, we've tried to institutionalize the collection of information that might be inconsistent with the agency's views. We have these federal advisory committees that are required, they're required by law, every agency has them. And the advisory committees often provide information and advice that the agencies don't like very much. And they try very hard not to take it. So I think we have a chart that shows how much advice agencies have actually taken from their advisory committees. Well, it turns out they take political advice very nicely. Political advice is how can you get your ideas through the process, but they don't take technical advice very easily. So this is an ongoing problem. When I looked back through the book, I thought this was one of the main problems we had identified, the difficulty of bureaucratic governments, forcing bureaucracies to do something other than what they already want to do. Another problem that is related is, I thought, cognitive entrenchment on the part of both decision makers and experts. Experts can become cognitively entrenched too. We tell the story of why Israel was very nearly defeated by Egypt in the 1973 war. Well, Israel's leading intelligence expert was committed to a particular view of Egyptian capabilities. And people would bring him information inconsistent with that view, and he would transfer them, fire them, ignore them, until one day the Egyptians didn't do what he thought they were going to do, and he got fired. But the country was almost defeated in that war. He was considered the world's leading intelligence expert until that moment. Cognitive entrenchment is a terrible problem on both sides. And I think the other, shall I call it a discovery? The other interesting finding, Collin teased this out of the work of Phil Tetlock and others, the idea of what Tetlock called the perpetual beta, that is the non-expert expert. People who aren't narrowly focused and are probably not the world's leading authorities on a particular thing. They cast their net broadly. They read, they're interested in lots of things, and usually they don't rise to the top, because there might be, in most organizations, they're considered a little flaky. They don't know their specialty as well as other people know it. But as a result, or as part of their personality, they are open to new ideas. And in times of crisis, these are the people who come to the rescue. In the case of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant was not the best, had not been considered a very good general before that. He wasn't as expert in anything as were the other officers of the Union Army, but he wasn't committed to known ideas at all. All the other officers had this vision of war, which they had learned at West Point, the Napoleonic decisive battle. Well, Grant hadn't done well in that course. He didn't have this commitment. He had a different idea of what warfare could be, and he prevailed. And we have or John Maynard Keynes, who wasn't the world's leading economist, but he wasn't committed to the monetary theories of the others. So these are examples that we find. And then we did a little experiment, which Colin mentioned. We made up some situations, and we told stories to survey respondents. Jen will find this familiar because in our book, she and I told lies to various respondents. Pardon? We got through the IRB review. I remember writing that our respondents didn't know anything at all, so telling them falsehoods would leave them knowing something, which shows how carefully the IRB read. But anyway, so we created little scenarios, and we administered to our respondents personality tests and looked to see where they scored on the I always want to say big three, but it's big five personality characteristics. And then we gave them little puzzles to solve. So my personal favorite was that they were supposed to imagine themselves as sea captains, captaining sailing ships, and they had to contend with pirates and storms and other hazards. And we would ask them, what would you do? Would you follow the established route? Would you do this? Would you do that? And there was a strong relationship between their personality attributes and their willingness to take risks, willingness to go, what do they used to say in Star Trek, where no one has gone before. So I found that very interesting, that in times of crisis, crisis both provides an opportunity for policymakers to reach out to new leaders and provides those people with a chance to try something new. In the ordinary course of events, no one would have turned to a Keynes or to a Grant or to anyone else. There wouldn't have been any reason to. And the other thing that I found that I took from our book when I reread it is that very often the right answer to the question, what should we do? Don't do anything. Because anytime decision makers use power, it's so fraught with risk. The chance of things turning out the way you thought they would is often so remote. I'll mention as an example, Vladimir Putin. He thought, and his experts told him, that no problem, we'll attack Ukraine and we'll conquer the place in a few days. It hasn't worked out very well, and could very well lead to, if not World War III, the destruction of Russia as we know it. So experts are not very good at telling policymakers the risks of what they're advising, or disabusing policymakers of thinking that what they're going to do will be a cakewalk. And we have not only our society, but many others are kind of action oriented. I want a president to run for office and say, my fellow Americans, my plan is, if elected, I'm not going to do anything. Because that's the right thing to do. But no one would do that. We expect action, and action is always risky. There was a study a few years ago of the success of federal programs. I forget whether it was I think OMB sponsored a series. Was it OMB that?
Data?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's OMB.
OMB. So OMB sponsored a series of studies to measure the success of federal programs. Well, they weren't very successful. In fact, I think hardly any of them were successful, and some caused a lot of trouble. After they finished studying several hundred programs, OMB shut down the study because it was too embarrassing. And United Nations sponsored such a study on the international realm. Same thing. Most of what people do does more harm than doing nothing. And that's where I think experts could be so useful if it was possible, if they found it possible to say to policymakers, the best thing to do is to do nothing. That's my advice, but the world doesn't work that way.
So we have a few questions in the online. We had one question, which I think you've already sort of alluded to, is Kathy Hill was asking, is the issue more the use of expertise in the political system rather than expertise itself? We do want the best possible info to inform policymaking.
I think it's an issue of mismatch, right? I mean, I agree with Kathy, like we want to have experts that can provide the best insights, but I don't know that our system of government is sort of constitutionally set up in a way to optimize the integration of those kinds of insights into our policymaking process. I'm not sure exactly what political arrangement would be best for that, but it seems pretty clear there are some pathologies and mismatches with what we have right now with the way expertise works within it. So I don't think it's an issue of saying we don't think experts are bad. We think it's an issue of mismatch between what they're being asked to do by the government and what their skill set are. I don't know. Does that sound about right?
Well, yeah, but you know, even in the Platonic regime of philosopher kings, the philosopher kings can become cognitively entrenched too. You know, this is a case where you know, a single formula is bound to be wrong. You know, we need to constantly monitor what experts do, monitor what decision makers do, and you know, look at the conflicts between the two. You know, I always think the framers of the Constitution were right. Power against power. We need to have checks and balances, oversight. These are the things that protect us from misguided policymakers, from misguided experts, and from unfortunate mismatches between the two. It's the best we can do.
We had a question from Ashley asking, are there any bureaucracies around the world who seem to have a better grasp on the use of experts than others, i.e. less corruption, more politically neutral acceptance of advice?
Not an expert on all democracies around the world. I would strongly suspect that the things that we are identifying here are not unique to the US and are probably characteristic of many systems around the world.
Yeah, and I think she's identified a very significant question for research. You know, the field of comparative bureaucracy is not sufficiently robust. And if someone can identify particular characteristics of bureaucracies, openness to change, oversight, and, you know, try to study differences among bureaucracies. My own guess would be that bureaucracies in democratic systems are less entrenched, less given to bureaucratic inertia than bureaucracies in authoritarian systems. But even in democratic systems, we don't do that well. So when policymakers in the United States want to compel a bureaucracy to change its ways, this leads often to decades of struggle. One of my favorite examples is the US Coast Guard. I don't know if anyone's familiar. Has anyone ever visited Coast Guard headquarters? It's a great place to visit because if you walk down the corridor, you see everything you need to know. Picture after picture after picture of Coast Guard cutters in action in World War II attacking German U-boats. That's the Coast Guard's vision of itself. It's the Navy. And every other mission that the Coast Guard has ever been assigned, it hasn't wanted to do. Boating safety, they don't care about boaters. They let them all drown. They want to sail their little boats into hurricanes. We don't care. Drug interdiction, we're not interested in that. We want to sink German U-boats. So different administrations have tried different things with the Coast Guard. Now, the Coast Guard, as you may have noticed, has moved around from agency to agency to agency. As people have tried to get it to do what it's supposed to do. There are no German U-boats there. Right now, I think it's in the Treasury Department. But this is like, oh no, it's in Homeland Security. It was in Treasury before that, but it didn't work out. So now they're in Homeland Security, which they like a little bit better, but they want to be in the Department of Defense. So they shirk in Homeland Security too. So after decades of moving them around, decapitating the leadership, all sorts of things, the Coast Guard is still an unhappy and uncooperative agency that wants to sink U-boats. And we could go to every agency in this town and tell a story like that, though perhaps not as extreme. Agencies are very committed to what they do, and bureaucrats and decision makers, Congresses, presidents who want to get them to do something else takes a long, long time to wean them from their old ways. I can't resist telling another story. I like stories. Anyone know the story of the Air Force and the A-10 attack plane? No? You know what the A-10s are? They're these ugly planes, they call them warthogs. They're supposed to attack tanks. Well, the A-10 is a terrific plane, but the Air Force was always trying to get rid of it because it was inconsistent with the Air Force mission. The Air Force's mission is to fly around and shoot down enemy fighters. Well, there haven't been a lot of enemy fighters up there capable of shooting it out with the Air Force for quite a long time. The A-10 was built for ground attack. The Congress made them do it, but they don't like it. They keep trying to get rid of it. One time they tried to sell them all to Poland. At another time they put them in the reserves. Then they had a wonderful plan. There were two things that Congress wanted the Air Force to do that it didn't want to do. One was fly A-10s. The other was to give women a chance to fly combat aircraft, which it didn't want to do. Well, the solution was obvious. Put women in the cockpits of the A-10s. I don't know if you've ever seen videos of an A-10 squadron. A lot of the pilots are women. And the A-10s are, the Air Force says it's too dangerous for women up there, but the A-10s are very dangerous because they fly down low, everybody shoots at them. But, you know, this is bureaucracy in action. The plane was too good. That we don't do that kind of thing. So it's very, very difficult, even in a democracy, to get bureaucracies to do what you want them to do.
We had a question from Hiroshi, who was referencing the point you made about the Japanese naval bureaucracy during World War II and how a highly trained expert group tends to have closed-mindedness. And sort of paraphrasing, looking at the relationship between experts and politics today, we see examples of leaders arbitrarily dismissing experts who are inconvenient, and suggest that it's necessary to enhance independence of experts in terms of personnel affairs. And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it happens. I mean, I don't know what else to say, really. I mean, I think that, as we've discussed in the book, I mean, politicians are very good at systematically ignoring and dismissing people that provide advice that is contrary to them. And so I think the military examples that Ben uses are particularly apt because the military is such a strict bureaucracy. I mean, it is very systematic, and the institutional cultures are very strong there. But it's just true across all bureaucracy. I guess I don't know if I have much to add. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, it's a matter of balancing. We want decision makers to be able to dismiss experts because left to themselves, experts become entrenched like others. On the other hand, we don't want decision makers to be able to cavalierly dismiss experts who disagree with them. How do you strike that balance? Well, to the extent that this relationship is public rather than behind closed doors, that I think is a plus. Turnover, we turn over decision makers. I've always advocated turning over bureaucrats more rapidly. Sorry, bureaucratic officials even serve even longer than tenured professors. Shouldn't be allowed. Publicity, turnover, these are good things. But, we learned from Thucydides. If you've never read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars, one of the best books ever written, not just on war, but on administration more generally, Thucydides says it's in crisis, only in crisis. As long as things are peaceful and moving along, no problems. But in crisis, people either learn or they don't learn. And his example is in his so-called Melian dialogue, where the Athenians land on the island of Melos during the wars and attempt to build a naval base. And the Melians say, no, you get out of here. You can't build that base on our island. And the Athenians say, well, we don't want to bother you, but we're going to build a base. The Melians say, we will fight. The Athenians say, you're crazy. Our army is 10 times as big as yours. Just let us build our base. And the Melians say, well, our cause is just. The gods will support us, and surely we'll win. And the Athenians reply, well, we are second to none in our reverence for the gods. We sacrifice before every battle and whatnot. But we've learned that the gods tend to favor the side with the larger army. So we recommend that you not attack. Well, the Melians didn't listen, they attacked and were destroyed. So Thucydides learns from this that it's war that's a stern teacher. War teaches people to discard foolish ideas and to try to think rationally. Well, we can generalize from that it's crisis that forces people to think straight. When the country isn't in crisis, experts and decision makers can muddle along. But when a time of crisis arises, that's when we ask ourselves, will decision makers listen? They don't always. Sometimes the country goes down the tubes. Will experts be found who can provide appropriate advice? That's when what was that expression? The old Firestone ad, the rubber meets the road at that point.
I mean, the problem is to some extent, and Ben says that war is an agent of rationality. In moments of crisis, people tend to make the right decision. The problem is that bureaucracies, especially in the federal government, don't operate in the same kind of market setting that other businesses or organizations would. So I mean, programs can keep going forever, and there won't be the same degree of competition or possibility of failure that you'd have in a market setting. So because of that, you have practices of just press on and continue with inertia that would end in other settings, but that's not the way government works. And so bureaucracies just kind of roll forward without that kind of competitive pressure you might have in other settings. And that's a real problem. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have, governmental programs and things, but it is something you have to be cautious about. And it would be nice if you could have turnover occasionally in bureaucracies that would just have an automatic fresh start once in a while. I mean, the pacing for that is a matter for open discussion, but more systematic turnover probably would be helpful in keeping perspectives fresh.
But that's not true at the university. Can't possibly be true.
No comment.
One final question for you. Anne was asking to just briefly illustrate the difference between data scientists, mathematicians, and statisticians, and who do you think would have a greater chance of telling truth about it?
So data scientists, mathematicians, and who else?
Statisticians.
Statisticians.
It's sort of like the joke of data scientist, mathematician, statistician walks in the
hall. Well, I mean, so it raises a good point, actually, is that there are, in the world of quantitative methods and quantitative reasoning, there are people who are interested purely in improving mathematical processes, making algorithms more efficient, finding the fastest and best and newest and hottest way to increase the accuracy of a classifier in these kinds of settings. This is important and interesting work, but it is not the same thing as knowing how to frame a question effectively, to gather the right kinds of data you need to answer a question, And what are the policy relevant implications of the findings that you have? You know, if you create a new classifier and you increase your accuracy in judging, you know, whether or not, you know, a classic example is you know, a machine learning algorithm that would tell you the likelihood that someone is going to default on a loan if you offer them a loan, right? I mean, what's the difference between 96.5 and 97% in a practical matter? A statistician or a mathematician may be very excited that they got a new algorithm that has that tiny marginal gain. But for a policymaker, that simply might not be that relevant, or the amount of information you need to have that increase in accuracy may require such an intense, maybe so resource intensive that it may not offset the gains you'd make in terms of real accuracy. And so if I may plug my program in the data analytics and policy program, part of our objective is to offer students this interdisciplinary take on data science that allows you to become literate enough in these fields to be able to use the tools that the mathematicians and the statisticians come up with, but also have the breadth of experience, the perpetual beta-ness to your way of looking at the world, that you will be able to recognize when those are really useful innovations and when they are not. And I say that with all due respect to all my mathematician and statistician friends, please keep working on your algorithms and give them to me, and I'll help the world become a better place. So I guess that's a good ending point.
Great. Dr. Ginsberg, Dr. Paschall, thank you as always for your time and your guidance.
I'm glad you fielded that one. As academic counsel, I have to answer that question.
Oh, okay.
The engineers were very hostile to my answer.
All right, thanks.